All right. Where we left off last Thursday is we were talking again, we can kind of go back. We were talking about different types of treatments that had been used, and we looked at things like trephining, banishment. We will get into the witch hunts and whatnot here probably in the next week or so, because I think it's a very interesting turning point in our understanding of mental illness and abnormality. So it's an unfortunate one, but it definitely highlights how societies have changed their views. We talked about how a lot of mental illness throughout history, especially in Western history, was seen as an individual had some type of moral corruption, that they were either possessed by a demon, or they were being persuaded by evil spirits or the like, and that's what caused their abnormality or their behaviors that they had. And so in this moral corruption theory, again, with at least within the Western countries, is going to last clear up through the Protestant movement, when we in Western culture we changed the view that you didn't have to go through the Pope or through a church leader to have access to God. You could have an individual relationship with God, and that started to change the view of mental health and mental illness, because it wasn't based upon some dictum that the church or whoever was providing for that individual. So we will see that change, and we'll see it most abruptly again when we get to the witch hunts. We do know some about indigenous beliefs, and I'm going to make this statement very clear. When I talk about indigenous beliefs, it's just not here in the Americas, it's worldwide. And one very common theme is the influence of bad spirits or bad uh, issues. We will see, though, that more important, especially here within Native Americans, a very common theme is that people who had a quote unquote mental illness or abnormality is because they were not being part of nature. And remember, spirituality has a lot to do with nature in many Native American communities. But that's a very generalized statement. That's why we need to investigate each of our communities as we move forward, because it's a very general statement. Okay. Um, we talked about trephining as one of the early forms, and the reason I really brought up trephining is we have evidence of it both here in the Americas and the European countries, and we even see them into Russia and the East, with Asiatic countries. So trephining seems to be something that um, uh, didn't have land barriers or belief barriers. It was done as a form of treatment in some way. And a lot of the evidence suggests it was originally done to release that evil spirit out of the person by doing the hole right at the top of their head. Now, not all theories of mental illness or abnormality was based upon um, uh, uh, spirits or demons or morality. There were theories that were based more upon the human condition as it is. And one of the examples of this is the Greek humor theory. Okay. The Greek humor theory actually came from Hippocrates. The hold on just a second. And Hippocrates was actually kind of one of our first modern medical physicians. He's the one that, when you graduate from your medical school, if you're becoming a medical doctor, you take the Hippocratic Oath, where you promise to do no wrong. Um, And he came up with the theory of humors, and this is an example of it. There's many examples, but basically the main theory behind it is it's based upon the four elements. So if we look at the four elements of fire, air, water, and earth, okay, there, what Hippocrates believed is that there was a relationship with these four elements and different bodily fluids. So he related air to blood as an example, and water to phlegm, and fire to bile, and earth to bile as well. Okay, and so what he theorized is that when these things are out of balance, remember these four elements for the world to be in balance have to be in balance. Okay, and we're going to see this idea of what's called homeostasis. Okay, what Hippocrates believed and clear up into modern medicine today, it is believed that the perfect health that we have is a homostatic or homostasis state, meaning everything is in balance. There's nothing out of measurement or under measurement. And I mentioned last Thursday about, when you go to a doctor, you get your blood drawn, they have this zone of homostatic for your all the elements that they're looking for in your blood. Okay. Um, and so the idea is that a healthy person has all of these elements in balance, in homostatic uh, placement. When one of these start to look a different color, or they start looking different than what you would expect them to look normal. So if especially with a child or an adult, if they have a yellow bile, that usually means they're choleric or have a very bad temper. If you have a black bile, it's more melancholy, sadness. You would kind of almost say it's a depressed type state. If your phlegm is a different type of color other than the clear color it should be, according to this theory, you tend to be very unemotional. When you bleed red, that means you're being optimistic or positive, but if you bleed a different color, be careful. Okay. Um, and and I just want to make a note before we move on today, because to a lot of people this sounds ridiculous, but we still do this today. Okay, when you go to a doctor, they're either going to take a urine sample, a bile sample, and a blood sample, and they're going to assume that based upon the different elements with any of those determines whether you might have a disorder or you might be sick or not. Okay. So while this may sound kind of weird in some senses, remember, we still do this in modern medicine today about looking at bodily fluids and trying to determine a different state of health. Okay, this is just the origins of those ideas. And again, I did mention, when we talk about the word humor, when you say someone's humorous, you're saying that their bodily fluids look good. When you're saying someone is a bad humor, you're saying that their bodily fluids are bad or not looking good. So something to kind of laugh in the back of your mind when someone says you're being humorous or not. Um, but what kind of treatments, we got to ask, did this lead to? And what was it effective? Okay. Well, if you have bad humors, one of the ways you could get rid of those bad humors is through letting those fluids out. Okay. And the most popular, especially when it came to mental illnesses, people who were acting abnormal, the most popular type of treatment was something known as bloodletting. Okay. Now, bloodletting is anywhere from putting leeches on a person and letting the leeches suck out the blood humors out of the individual, to where, especially with those who were claimed to have a severe mental illness, you would lay them on a table and you would stick a needle into their back and you would just basically drain their blood out until you thought that they were better. Okay. Now, the question is, and the question is, well, did this work? And the answer kind of is, yeah, it did work, because it made the individuals so lethargic because they were getting close to death because their blood was being drained out, that they no longer acted quote unquote crazy or quote unquote abnormal. So this treatment, this type of treatment, we can see clear up into the 1900s, and even we can see some bloodletting occur in World War One and between World War One and World War Two, because it was seen as an effective form of treatment. Um, Now, in the field of mental health, especially in more modern terms of bloodletting, it developed into something we call the cathartic release. Okay. Now, I kind of want to explain what I mean by cathartic release. It's the idea that just by opening up and talking about something, it can relieve your symptomology. It can relieve your what's going on inside. And when we look at counseling, we see that it's a form of catharsis. And the question is, does it work or not? And the answer is yes and no. Okay, when we're dealing with something like a mood disorder or an anxiety disorder, if we're dealing with trauma victims, or I should say trauma survivors, catharsis does work, letting them come to a safe place, in a non-judgmental place, and allowing them to speak or talk about whatever they want seems to be an effective way of relieving symptoms. And this was found in research done on the fact that most people, we're talking greater than 70% of people, don't return to a therapy session after the first or second session. And we want to know why. Was it something to do with the therapy? Is it something to do with the therapist, or the like? Is it the financial part of it? And the large answer was surprising. The large answer was no. In fact, when we look at about 90% of respondents, it wasn't that they didn't like the therapist or the therapy or anything else. It's just after the first or second session, they felt relief of their symptoms. And many of them explained it in this way. I'm kind of trying to paraphrase some of the interviews they did, but basically what the majority of these people said is that for the first time in their life, someone said, you can say anything you want. This space, these four walls are between you and I. And then they do the legal disclaimer, except for child abuse, vulnerable adults, of course, right? But, and I won't tell anybody, I'm just here to listen. It is the first time a lot of these individuals had someone just say, I'm going to listen to you with no judgment. No, and I'm not going to go tell a bunch of people about it. I'm not going to, you can tell me anything you want. And it's the first time in a lot of people's lives that they had that opportunity. And therefore, that alleviated a lot of their symptoms. Okay. Now, I said, does it work? And I said yes and no. Okay. There is a area in which cathartic release doesn't work. Okay. And it comes to the issue of anger. Okay. We probably have all heard the bottle up theory of anger, that people hold things in, hold things in and hold things in until the pressure builds so much that it just releases and it spews everywhere. Okay. And a lot of research has been done. Is this a valid theory of anger and anger outbursts? And the scientific evidence, I will say, is no. There is no scientific evidence that there's a bottle up thing and a pressure that then finally releases. And the other thing we found is, based on the bottle up theory, one of the main treatment modalities for anger is to let someone just yell it out, scream, 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 let it go, let it go. And in that moment, what we do find, and what a lot of clinicals observe, is the person does seem relieved by their emotions. They seem to be less angry about their emotions. But further investigation about letting someone scream it out suggests that within the next 24 to 72 hours, it actually increases aggression. It doesn't decrease the aggression. The initial feeling that individuals get when they express their anger in a very emotional way has to do with the adrenaline running through the person's body. It's that feeling of elation and calm that comes with adrenaline rushes, but not necessarily releasing one's anger. And what we have found through further research, and the reason why it increases aggression for several days later, is when you do that cathartic release of your anger, you're reminded of all the reasons you're angry. And so you then ruminate about the anger that you were experiencing. So, so when I say, does cathartic release work? In certain contexts, it does. When we're dealing with mood disorders, when we're dealing with anxiety disorders, there's even some evidence that it works with certain psychoses. But when we're dealing with things like anger and aggression and violence, allowing that cathartic release actually puts the person at more risk of being angry and violent for at least the next 24 to 72 hours. Okay. So cathartic release works in some conditions, but not so much in other conditions. And that's something to kind of keep in mind when you say, you just need to go blow your top. If you're going to give that advice, I would stay away from the person for at least the following 72 hours. So, all right. So, again, what can we say about this Greek humor theory? Bloodletting, does it work? Yes and no, because you're just bringing the person to death, and you've drained enough blood out of them. They're so lethargic that they can't behave in any way. Does cathartic release help individuals? As we just explained, in some situations it does, in some situations it doesn't. Do we still use the humor theory today? Yes, we do. It's probably not in this model, but whenever you go and get your blood drawn, or you urinate in a cup, or you provide a sample of your bile, you are doing what started with Hippocrates, and the person is looking at your bodily fluids to try and help you determine if there's something wrong with you or not. So that's the Greek humor theory. And as you can see, it's followed us through today. And it's followed us just as much, and we'll go back here, as earlier moral theories, okay? Because again, I just want to bring this up, that we still have this cultural influence that prevents us from going and seeking help, because we still have this cultural idea that if you have a mental illness, if you have, or you're just having troubles, there's something weaker or more inferior about you, and to go seek help would be to admit that there's something morally, and I'll use this term again, morally wrong with you. And throughout this course, I'm hoping that we can banish that idea, and that very much enculturated view of mental illness and one we're experiencing the world not as we should. Okay. Okay. Come on. All right. Okay. So probably the height of Western examples of the moral corruption theory was within the witch hunts of earlier days. And we're actually going to spend here in a couple weeks a, a lecture or two specifically talking about the witch hunts and how they propagated some very negative ideas, but they were also kind of on the cusp of us defining mental illness from more scientific, more observational views. So it'll be what we call a double-edged sword conversation about this period of time lasting from the 1400s clear up into the 1800s in the Americas and in the European countries, and we will see its influence on how we view mental illness and those types of things today, especially when it comes to our view of gender and and the like, as we will see when we go through the witch hunt history here in a couple weeks or in another week or so. Um, when we look at Native American and medicine, what's known as the medicine man, this is where I'm bringing up the idea that in a lot of Native American communities, not all, and all of them tend to have a different view of what a medicine person, I should use that term more appropriately, is and how they relate in their community. So this is a very general statement, is that it's commonly believed that dysfunction arises from a disharmony between the person and nature. That we get away from nature, we get away from our community, and that's what creates dysfunction. And so, in many of these cases, we focus on the journey. So, a very common Native American, at least especially in this area, is the man in the maze. And the Tanahatham have adopted this very much, but there's a lot of different interpretations of the man in the maze. But each point to the center is supposed to represent a mile mark in one's journey, and it's where we evaluate something going on in our life. So childhood, adolescence, and the like is an example of that. And dysfunction in this model, and again, this is just one viewpoint of this, is that it is at that evaluation point where abnormality can take place. Okay. The other concept that is commonly adopted is communities take care of the individual who cannot take care of he or she self. But as we saw in our lecture from Thursday, there is some breaking points for Native American communities where they'll also utilize things like banishment in order to bring about harmony, probably within the community and within the people. So this is a common, again, not every Native American community adopts these views, but they tend to be pretty persistent over many groups of individuals. I would encourage anybody who wants to know more about this, the man in the maze model and whatnot, to look at, oh my goodness, Camillus Lopez model. It's the one we utilize here at TOCC in a lot of student journeys and classes. And it's a very interesting concept. You can YouTube search it if you'd like. But it's the one that we're trying to utilize here at the college to help students understand their educational journeys. So, okay. So what this does for us, so all of this history really breeds into our culture and brings about a lot of different ideas about who is abnormal and who's not abnormal, what is mental illness. When we look at different theories today, okay, we can really classify them in one, two, three, six different arenas of different thoughts of what causes different types of disorder. Okay. And I'm just going to summarize them right here for us right now. We'll get into them a little bit deeper as we start getting into different disorders and the like, and understanding different deviant behaviors. But psychoanalytics or psychodynamic theory is Sigmund Freud and a lot of neo-Freudians who believe that um, much of disorders are caused by unconscious drives or internal drives that we may not necessarily have an awareness of. Um, and in this model, dysfunction develops in early childhood, in the relationship between the mother and the child mainly, and the family system mainly. And that in order to understand the disordered behavior of somebody, we have to look at that complete life history to see where the dysfunction began in early childhood, and then bringing it up to whatever the age the person is today. Okay, so it's kind of a life history thing, but again, in this model, people don't necessarily understand why they are behaving or acting or feeling the way they do. Okay, a humanistic theory believes that disordered behavior comes from the failure to strive to one's potential and being out of touch with one's feelings. Okay. In the humanistic area, it's this idea that we all have a drive to become whatever our potential is. Okay. And when life makes it so we struggle towards that strife, that is what causes abnormality. That's what causes us to start to fail. And it's also so that it's a failure to strive, but then it's becoming out of touch with our own feelings and emotions. That there's two courses that create abnormality. One, because of life situations, we keep having the inability to strive towards our potential. And two, internally, because of that strife, we become disconnected with our feelings and our emotions, and then that drives whatever dysfunction we're experiencing. Okay. The behavioral route suggests that abnormality is caused by a learned history with our environment, that it is a maladaptive way where we were reinforced for negative behaviors and maybe punished for positive behaviors, and that left us with some type of dysfunctional way of relating with our world. Okay. Whew. The cognitive approach, and again, we'll get into these a lot deeper as we move through the course, but I'm just kind of summarizing them at this point. Cognitive approach believes that dysfunction is caused by irrational, dysfunctional thoughts and ways of thinking, that through time, our interpretation of the world becomes skewed, it becomes dysfunctional, and that drives our behaviors and our emotions. We will see that the cognitive and behavioral approaches will be combined to create a treatment modality known as cognitive behavioral therapy, which has had a lot of effect in a lot of for a lot of disorders, especially things like depression and anxiety disorders. We'll see that this has been one of our more effective treatment modalities, taking in a learned history, but also focusing on thoughts and irrational thoughts and ways of thinking about one's disorder. Okay. Sociocultural suggests that dysfunction is a dysfunction of society, that when we look at depression rates or anxiety rates or rates of psychosis, that it's a function of that given society and that culture. And as I explained in our first week of class, we will do some cross-cultural comparisons. And we will see the influence of this social cultural way of being that does give rise to higher rates of dysfunctions in some societies and not others. Okay. Um, I bring up the example of ADHD, I believe, in this class. We can also look at things like psychopathology and serial killing. Okay. When we look at psychopathology and serial killings, it wasn't until the late 1980s that you would find a psychopath being someone who lacks consciousness, uses others as objects, has no real self-recognition for themselves and for others. Serial killer being someone who kills individuals in separate periods of time and places with emotional coolings in between. All right. Up until the 1980s, we didn't see any psychopath and serial killers in Asiatic countries. There was none in Japan or China or Taiwan or the Philippines or any of those countries. It wasn't until those countries started to be westernized that starting in the mid to late 80s and up to today, we see an increase in psychopathology and serial killing in these Asiatic countries as a function of being Western culturalized. Okay. The same holds true when we've looked at what evidence we have about Native Americans here in the United States. We really don't find evidence of psychopathology among Native American communities until colonialization. Okay, and so we see this. The reason I bring this up is because there's some historical precedents and there's some cross-cultural precedents that we can show that culture and our socialization does play a role in the development of some disorders. Psychopathology is just one kind of clearer example that we can look at historical data here in the Americas, and we can do cross-cultural comparisons between Western and traditionally non-Western countries. Okay. We also, take the biomedical and neuroscience approach to disorders, which suggests that disorders are an organic problem, that they're a biochemical imbalance, and maybe genetics plays a large role. And the way that I want us to think about this is that with any disorder, whether we're talking about psychological or if we're talking about physical disorders, and I want to make this kind of clear, we will always find an organic component. But with a lot of disorders, we'll also find behavioral, cognitive, cultural issues behind those disorders. And we could look, clearly here in the United States, physical disorders such as obesity, such as diabetics, have a lot to do with our behaviors and the way we relate with the food, but also socioculturally about what type of foods and stuff we prefer to eat, our exercise, and all of those kinds of things then play into our genetic predispositions for certain things, our biochemical imbalances that then give away to the example of diabetes and obesity. Okay. And again, if we think about these, we cannot take out genetic predispositions. Okay. Because when I talk about diabetes and obesity, there are Americans who can eat very unhealthy. I think of my oldest brother, my older brother, when we were teenagers, he could have 5 Big Macs and he was fine. I would have one and I'd gain 10 pounds. Okay. And so genetics plays a role in the development of a lot of these disorders, but it takes the social cultural aspects into it as well. Now, with that being said, one of the things that we will discuss in this class when we get to certain disorders are which disorders are more organically propagated versus which ones are more environmentally propagated. Okay. And when I think about mood disorders and we think about clinical depression, we can see both cultural, social, cognitive, behavioral, trauma, and all those things, those life experiences that play a role into it. But when we look at another disorder, such as bipolar disorder, which bipolar 1, I'll just explain it real quick, is when we go through moments of elation, moments of manicness, and then we swing to moments of deep and horrible depressive states. And we swing back and forth between those. What we know about bipolar is that it is mainly organically based, because the only way to help treat someone who has bipolar is through some type of medication that stabilizes those biochemical imbalances. Treatment such as going to a counselor or a therapist in and of itself will not relieve the symptoms of bipolar as it will relieve the depression, the symptoms of clinical depression. So we'll talk about the interplays, which one are more organically based, which ones are more both, as we move through the class. And this brings us to probably the most popular model of understanding mental disorders that we have today, which is called the biopsychosocial model. Bio meaning that we have to take the physical aspects of the individual into account. Psycho, we need to take in the cognitive, we have to take in the behavioral and emotional aspects of the individual into account. And social, we need to take the person's social world into account and how they interact with other people. Within my area of study, I study identity and social identity and cultural identity and how it influences different health outcomes. And there's a lot of research on the social end, which I'm interested in, that show that when a therapist includes the importance of one's social identity and cultural identity into the therapeutic process, so talking about how they feel about their culture and their closeness to it, how they feel about different social identities, such as being a parent or a student or an employee, and strengthening those identities, we are finding increases the success for different type of treatments for depressions and for anxiety disorders. It increases their success by greater than 50%. So I bring this up because a lot of our models of treatment have mainly focused on the psycho end, but we're finding more and more that we have to have a balance between all three to successfully treat an individual. Okay. And these three disorders are just examples of disorders that we think are more organically based. So developmental disorders, this includes things like development, bipolar, schizophrenia. These type of disorders tend to need some type of physical intervention, physical medication, or whatever it may be, in order to alleviate. So these are just some examples of more organic type disorders. Okay. All right, I am going to stop sharing, stop recording.